All right, Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Liberty and Friends every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. here on the Big Daddy Liberty channel. Guys, welcome to it. It's not going to be a long show this evening. We're looking at about a 45 minutes broadcast, and I have, as always, a revolving door of friends that join us for the conversation tonight. Now, with that being said, and again, where are my manners? My name, of course, is Usikhle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. And if you love the show and like the content, whether you consume it on Facebook, YouTube, X, or Instagram, please do me a favor, like the content, guys. Smash that like button if you're watching and consuming the show on any of those mediums. And if it is on YouTube in particular, guys, subscribe, please, to the channel. Help me reach my goal of 46,000 subscribers by the end of the year, or actually even sooner. I would love that. With that being said, guys, welcome to it. As always, on Liberty and Friends, I'm not alone. I'm joined, of course, by this week's panel, which is made up of two individuals who I know are firm favorites on the show. Excuse me, guys, I'm battling a cold, but the show must go on. From the Free Market Foundation, a chap who is no stranger to this channel. I'm talking, of course, about Martin van Staden.
Hey, Shikhle, hope you feel better. Yeah, how are you?
I am very well. Good to have you on the show. Tonight's topic, of course, is a very important one, and I'm going to frame it in the context of a campaign that we're running at the moment with our friends over at the Institute of Race Relations, the What South Africa Can Be campaign. We have fired off some episodes in that regard, but before any of that, let me welcome my other guest tonight, who is from the Institute of Race Relations. I'm talking, of course, about Makone Maja. There she is on screen. Makone, good evening, ma.
Good evening to you and Martin, and I'm also sending you well wishes. It seems the colds decided to worsen as soon as the camera started rolling.
I was about to say, I'm dying here. It's terrible. But guys, with that being said, let's perhaps look at and zoom in on tonight's topic, because really, it's one which defines, sadly, South Africa, and it's one which we thought, at least in 1994, there would be a complete abandoning of it. And that is effectively how South African politicians, whether we go back in time to our colonial days, right through apartheid, and of course in today's dispensation, albeit there's a minute change as of this year, but still very much a nationalist, Afro-nationalist dispensation, has always used race and racist policies to pick society's winners and losers. This has always been the curse, if you will, of South Africa. Let me appropriate some language from the South African left. I'm going to repurpose it. You know, they always talk about the land question as being the original sin. I'll argue that actually no. South Africa's real original sin is the insistence and persistence of using race and racist policies to pick society's winners and losers. It is exactly why we're in the mess that we're in today. And tonight's question, I want to preface it in almost as a 2 or 3-headed hydra. I'm going to let you guys slay it for me. The first real head is, you know, we have this minor change. That's what I was referring to as of May this year. As of May this year, where we now have a government of national unity, which marks a tentative, and I'm careful with my language here, but a tentative and really small shift away from what has been 30 years of ANC dominance of our political landscape. Now, again, guys, all of these things come with little disclaimers and provisos. I'm very aware of the fact that the ANC effectively still has 70% of the portfolios. You can argue it's still dominant. But insofar as what the voters have chosen, they said, actually, no, the ANC moves from having about just short of 60% to now having only 40% of the vote. So it ushered in this government of national unity, to which we now have ministers from opposition parties populating this government. John Steenhuisen, the leader of the DA, Peter Groenewald of the Freedom Front Plus, Ubaba Nkosini Khabisa of the IFP. I can go down the line, Patriotic Alliance, Gator McKenzie, very popular figure at the moment. But I want to throw it to you, Makone, because the IR posted a very interesting question this week in a press release, basically asking the question: will these non-ANC ministers that are in government continue to operate as how we govern? Are we going to see these politicians basically accept the status quo of the ANC, which has been in government for the past 30 years, and use race as a way, and not only race, I'm sorry, and I'm hearing myself waffle here, but really race and actually racist policies to pick society's winners and losers. You guys asked the question, where were you going with this, and why is it an important question to throw at the GNU?
Yeah, I think I'll take aim at that hydra by first recapping South Africa's history and how racialization was institutionalized in the country. And I think we first have to look way back in the 1950s when the Population Registration Act first hit South African legislation. And in it were these four categories that were basically created, socially constructed, invented, you might say. These four categories would group people of different races, right, into those different boxes. And the idea of that was essentially to infer superiority onto one group and inferiority on the rest of the groups. So you will know that it's quite pervasive now that South Africa has four races: white, black, colored, and Indian. And through the Population Registration Act and its subsequent sister acts, the Bantustans Act, as well as the Land Areas Act, the apartheid government was effectively able to govern differently for people of different races, right? Again, by providing special privileges and rights to one group and then subjugating the rest of the groups to varying degrees. And you speak of 1994 when things turned, but it was actually earlier than that. You may remember, Sihle, that these acts were essentially repealed in the 90s already. So certainly long before apartheid fell and slightly even longer before we had our new constitution and constitutional dispensation. And when those acts were repealed, one would have assumed that when South Africa moved forward and further into democracy, we would essentially peel away from racialization, from racist policies, as you so aptly described. And yet, Martin will go deeper into this because he's done extensive work on this that we've continued to rely on. And I know I've even heard other media heads refer to Martin's work on this. I actually heard Gareth Cliff mention the race index laws, but they show that not only what it got to a point where we repealed so many of those racialized laws, and then suddenly we started gradually bringing them back into the country as we moved into the 2000s. And so our question is basically to the non-ANC GNU ministers, but they have not been the sole target of our campaign. We have also posed this question to the South African Human Rights Commission, which is very relevant because it was created to adjudicate over essentially racism and issues pertaining to human rights, right, of which race has been a kernel in the history of South Africa. And so we've asked the South African Human Rights Commission what role, if any, racial categories have in democratic and post-apartheid South Africa. We've also questioned and made target the Commission of Employment Equity because it has been a key driver of racialization in the country in one specific area, namely employment. But these two have been basically the bastions of racist policy and continued and sustained racialization in the country. The South African Human Rights Commission, actually, as of Friday, has agreed to meet with us and to provide us with a report on their position on racialization. And it must not be undermined. I mean, the South African Human Rights Commission is a Chapter 9, it's a Constitution Chapter 9 institution. So it carries some weight. I know they're questioning their role currently, trying to understand the limits of their powers at present, but they've played a significant role in democratic South Africa, and they continue to shape a lot of the dialogue specifically around race. You know that every time there's a racist incident, people immediately report it to them. And so they have adjudicated over racial conflict, racial tension in South Africa for 30 years now. They've got that institutional knowledge on how race and racialization functions in the country. And so that question, pointing that question at them has been for us a very pointed way of dealing and addressing racialization. I'll also say that to prove the fickleness of this idea of race as a legal concept, because that's what we're questioning. We're no longer questioning the culture of race. People are allowed to identify as they please, and we believe that they should. For example, I identify as a Black person, but what we're questioning is the legal definition of these words. What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean legally to be white? And how do you describe those things without referring to the very Population Registration Act, the Land Areas Act, the Bantustans Act? How do you continue to define those concepts without constantly punting to those racist policies, blatantly racist policies from apartheid that were repealed even before democracy? And those are the questions we particularly posed to the SHRC. How do you define those concepts legally? You will find a few statutes in South Africa that actually provide definitions. For example, the Employment Equity Act. And I was about to describe the fickleness of these definitions by pointing to how it defines Black people, right? It describes Black people as an all-encompassing term to include coloreds and Indians, but it provides for different treatment of those races. So it gives the impression that these people are of equal status or equal value, let's say, but how then does it measure them differently in its application of like employment equity targets, for example? So clearly that definition is meaningless because those people are treated differently. But again, it continues by treating them through varying degrees to infer that superiority we were describing of earlier. And then our question to the Employment Equity Commission is similar. How does it define race, and how does it determine those arbitrary categories of race? To the GNU non-ANC ministers, our question is, well, they were non-racial before this. They upheld that constitutional value of non-racialism. Will they still do that even now when they are the incumbents, when they are in government? And what does that look like for them? Said a mouthful, but that's a good summary.
It also is a very good place to start, because it does speak to effectively the hypocrisy that we often hear here, because there's effectively three elements here. There's the historical element, which is carried over into today. There's the ideological impetus that drives a lot of what is the racialized climate of today, which is, again, it also subdivides into levels of hypocrisy, where people who claim that they're non-racial then adopt racialized policies in their view to eradicate past racism. It's a hypocrisy which is delicious in its nature, and we'll get to that in a moment. And also, pardon me, there's the third element, as I said, where it is a grift. It is a pure grift. And you're naming some Chapter 9 institutions, which I will argue are part of the grifters of this, who use race, or rather, let me be precise and specific, who argue that racism is a one-way directioned vehicle, in the sense that it is certain individuals in society, and then they extrapolate further. Certain individuals of a certain race in society who are racist, to which, in their view, as a Chapter 9 institution, they are here to fight against them, because they argue that those individuals are the progenitors of racism, despite the fact that the very government and the very institutions of the state that empower them to an extent are just as racist and racialized. Again, there are these three areas of hypocrisy here that we deserve to sort of chew on tonight, as we remind you that you're watching Liberty and Friends here on the Big Daddy Liberty channel. If you are watching, remember, you are very much a part of tonight's show. Your comments will be flighted on the screen. If you have any questions for any of our panelists tonight, please make sure you put that into the comment section. And hey, guys, please remember, hit that like button. It really does magic to getting this show out there. And I want the show to be as widely watched as possible, because we're going to slay the dragon of using race in this country as a means of picking winners and losers in society. Enough with the racism. Martin, I'm going to come to you, because there is a historical impetus here, as I said, and you've developed this index, which quite aptly and profoundly shows how racialized policy really finds albeit it finds its genesis pre-colonial times, through colonial times and apartheid, but it's exploded in a sense in supposedly democratic times. How is that possible when the ANC as a party claims, as they often do, that they are, quote, non-racial in their approach? But you've shown in your research that actually that's simply not true.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ikle. Yeah, so I think the way I always start when I explain this index is I have to make this note because most ordinary people don't realize it, and that is that in common law, there is no such thing as race. Now, common law is basically the law that exists when there are no acts of parliament or no regulations or no judges. It's a little bit more complex of judges, but when there is no positively created law, there's common law. Now, the common law is still all around us. We have common law all around the world, and the common law knows no race. So the only way that you can have an idea, a notion of race law, is if some politician decides to make a law, and they call it law, and I tend to dispute that these things are laws, then they have to go and sit around a table and say, hey, we agree to make race legally relevant for these and those purposes. And now we have a race law. And that is something that's been happening since, as you said, colonial times, since the 1600s. Common law didn't arrive racially in South Africa. People came here and they created regulations, they created bylaws, and they created acts of parliament. Now, the Index of Race Law, which I maintain on behalf of the Institute of Race Relations, which, again, this can be accessed by anyone. There's a few conspiracy theorists online who act like there's this hidden list that's being kept somewhere that's very deceptive. Actually, you can just go and look, and you can kind of fact check me if you want. It's at racelaw.co.za. It's all there. And I started that in 1910. Now, that's when the South African Parliament, as it exists today, was established in 1910. Before that, we had various colonies and republics in this region that we know as South Africa, and they all also had race laws. But maybe far into the future, I'll go beyond the South African Parliament. But currently, starting in 1910 up to the present day, the South African Parliament has adopted 314 race laws. Now, how do I define a race law? And I keep it very simple just to kind of exclude my own kind of ideas and ideology from what is and it is in a race law. And it's simply this: any law that makes race relevant or keeps race relevant from existing laws. So I take the common law as the baseline, which knows no race. If you add something on top of that that makes race relevant, then that is a race law. It doesn't matter how it's made relevant. It might be a great law, even in my opinion. If it makes race relevant, it's a race law and it's included. So 314, 314 since 1910. You can see this graph that resonates with people, and it shows there from 1910 how progressively Parliament started adding more and more and more race laws every single year until a peak, and that first peak over there is on the year 1980. The year 1980 is when South Africa had the most race laws during, let's say, the previous dispensation on the book. And in that year, there were 123 race laws in South Africa. And from that peak, it began going downwards. And that's what Makone referred to earlier, when race law didn't just stop in 1994, when the interim constitution was adopted and we had our first democratic elections. Actually, most race laws had been repealed by that time, and it was really through the 1980s when the National Party really became, as far as race is concerned, very reformist. It was still a securocrat entity, but racially, very few National Party members remained dedicated to the apartheid idea, you can say. So those laws started falling away in the 1980s and reached, let's say, a low, which to us is a good thing, in the year 1990. 93 was the pre-apartheid year when we had the lowest number of race laws. That's 54 race laws, down from the high of 123 in 1980. And that continued very shortly after the democratic elections in up to 1996. And that is when the lowest ever number of race laws were on the book in the current South African polity, which is 52. That is the floor that we've reached as far as race law is concerned. 52 is the lowest number of race laws ever in the Republic and the Union of South Africa. And from there, from 1996, there has been I don't want to say it's a steady and a gradual increase like it was from 1910. It was a very, very sudden and very, very dramatic increase in the number of race laws. Because 2 years after 1996, 1998, that is the year in South African history that the most race laws were ever adopted. That is a democratic year. That is 1998. 2 years into democracy, we adopted the most race laws in a single year ever since 1910. That is 20 race laws in the year 1998. And the second highest number of race laws ever adopted in South African history since 1910 is the year 2000, another democratic year, and that is 17 race laws. And then just for comparison, during apartheid, the year in which we adopted the most race laws in a single year is 1976, which is only 9 race laws. So it's a very gradual increase during apartheid, but a very sudden increase in the democratic period. So the kind of relevant statistics up to now are that since 1994, since April of that year, when we had our first democratic elections, 117 race laws have been adopted. 117, and the latest one was adopted this very year, 2024. And think about that for just a moment. In total, 314 adopted since 1994, 117. That is 37% of all the race laws that South Africa's parliament ever adopted have been adopted since 1994, South Africa's era of non-racialism. And there's even some laws left over from the previous dispensation, or laws that the current government, the current democratic parliament, went back to the 1930s. They found a non-racial act of parliament that was adopted back then, and they made it racial by amending it. So as we sit here today, there's 142 race laws that are in operation. These are laws on the book. They sit as active acts of parliament on the statute book. That's 142. That is 45% of the total. That means that basically half of all race laws that the South African Parliament has ever adopted remain in force. Now, that's just a very kind of broad summary of how it works. I think one observation, that's two observations I think that are key here. The first is, I'm not saying, and I don't think anyone at the IRR or the FMF has ever said this, but we are treated like we say this, that the race laws that we have today are as bad as the race laws we had during segregation and during apartheid. No one is saying that. No one has claimed that from what I've seen from within our circles. And I haven't quantified it, so I can't say one way or the other that it is or isn't true, but my gut tells me that certainly the race laws from those days were far worse, were significantly worse. They were far more fundamental. They were far more interventionist into your daily life as a black person specifically, telling you what you can and cannot do, whereas race laws today, despite being more numerous, are not that fundamental. They are far more cosmetic. They are far more dedicated to representativity and representation, which is really ultimately a vibes thing rather than a real social engineering thing. It does do harm. I must say it does do great harm, but it is not quite as bad. So that's the first thing that I think we should just note. And the second thing, which I've gotten into a lot of trouble for this, and I'm sure I will continue to get into a lot of trouble for this, and that is that you cannot judge these things by intention, because what we've been seeing since 1994 is that the previous dispensation's race laws are judged by their consequences, rightly so. They say that apartheid was terrible. It impoverished millions of black people. It was a system of oppression. It is terrible. and that's correct. So it's judged by its consequences. It's judged by its inherent nature. Not even if you forget about the consequences, there's an evil in excluding people from participating in economics in their own country. So that dispensation is judged by consequences and the nature of race law. The new dispensations race law, let's call them the democratic race laws, they're all judged by intention. And our constitutional court has gone so far as to say that when we judge race law, we judge it by intention only. So we have this double standard. Old race laws judged by consequence, new race laws judged by vibes and intentions. And that is exactly the wrong way to approach this thing. If you cannot judge these things by their intentions, because if you do, you have to extend that back. And just like with any oppressive regime, even the race laws from the previous regime were well intended, despite how misguided and fundamentally, from our liberal perspective, evil they were. So you cannot do that, because then you're not actually looking at the policies. You're just looking at the vibes and the rhetoric that's coming from politicians. So those are two important things that I think you have to kind of bear in mind when you look at something like a race law index.
I wanna break it down a bit further as we are in the last half of tonight's show. Welcome to it. This is Liberty and Friends. I'm in conversation with Makone Maja, who of course is from the Institute of Race Relations, and Martin from Staden from the Free Market Foundation. The question we're asking tonight is, should race be, or rather, let me rephrase, should South Africa continue to use race to pick South Africa's winners and losers? And with that even being said, we're zooming even further, and we're asking the question of this new GNU. Should it and its new ministers, especially those who come from opposition parties, continue to use race to classify South Africans? That's the conversation we're having tonight. Guys, before I bring in questions from the audience, and they're coming thick and fast, I can see it in the comment sections. There's also a political, or pardon me, as I'm now looking for the word, an ideological imperative behind why, whether it was during apartheid or today's South Africa, race continues to be the means by which politicians try and organize society. Now, I'm going to leave apartheid for a moment because Martin rightly pointed out that we've rightly, as a society collectively, chastised politicians of yesteryear, namely apartheid, for the outcomes of their policies and, of course, the intentions of them. However, what we haven't done is chastise the intentions of today's racialized politics and racist politicians. Instead, we're trying to argue that the intentions of what they're doing is noble. You often hear the argument, guys, that, the ANC is non-racial, but because of our past, it has to use race to fix the mistakes of the past. And then you have cascading from that, from the echelons of state power into the institutions of our universities, which is another topic for which we can chew on fully, insofar as how race and really identity has become the be-all, end-all of how to organize society. But nonetheless, you have a situation where there is an ideology, I'm trying to argue, that's driving this. And it's an ideology which has now firmly found root in the institutions of government. And that ideology is really it's a progressive ideology insofar as where it finds roots, but it's an identitarian, if I can steal that word, ideology, which basically says your identity should determine what you do or do not get in a society. And part of that identity, whether it's race or gender, stratifies you or organizes you into a tier of the most victimized to the oppressor. That's the range that it plays in. And this identity, if you will, or that dichotomy of oppressor versus oppressed or victim is firmly in the left. It has been what has defined South African government for the past 30 years. I'm going to come to you, Makone, because often you'll hear this, and I want to be a little bit raw and maybe even vulgar in trying to make this point. Black individuals like you and I, who are liberals and classical liberals, libertarian or conservative, will often be called by other Black individuals sellouts, Uncle Toms, coons, house Negroes. I can go down the line. And why? Because the ideology that drives the individuals who say things like that argue that we should be homogenous, or we should think alike based on race. And that because of that based on race thinking, different races are on different tiers. One should be treated as an oppressor, the other should be treated as a victim. So how dare you, Makone, or you, Sikhle, or Dumont, or any of the other Black individuals who are liberals who don't think along these lines, how dare we speak out as individuals when we should belong to these groups and self-identify as race victims?
Yeah, I think there's two things going on there in those scenarios, Sihle. And I think one of them is just people who are struggling to embrace freedom, and that people who are of their own race should be free to hold beliefs that they find abhorrent at worst, and unfortunate at best. I think the other thing is that I do want to give people the benefit of the doubt and say maybe they haven't considered deeply the origins of race and how it continues to shape our society today. And that's why I started with the history lesson of where the racial classification emerges from, and that it was an invention and a key driver, key infrastructure to apartheid. It held apartheid together. Without the Population Registration Act, apartheid simply does not occur, right? And so by stating that history and drawing back to it, I'm hoping that that gives people who hold those victimhood narratives closely, that it gives them an opportunity to really cross-examine their position. I must say also, when you spoke earlier about opposition parties, that there's actually been unanimity across the three biggest, well, perhaps not no longer three biggest, but formerly the three biggest parties in South Africa, the EFF, the ANC, and the DA, about this issue of racial classification. And it's been mooted in parliament as well. And three parties agree that the race should not be used as a measure of classification in South Africa. The issue is that individuals within these parties who have power and different authority in various portfolios are the ones who disagree. For example, when this issue was brought to parliament, it was through a movement called the PARC, the People Against Racial Classification. It was a gentleman called Glenn Snyman, who you'll remember is from the Western Cape. He was, I think, charged with fraud for declassifying himself as colored because he finds it to be a pejorative to be called colored. Fair enough, right? There's evidence to show that coloreds share ancestry with the original Africans, the Khoi people. And so he would rather be, if racial classification is to hold, I think he would rather be classified as Black. And he was charged with fraud, by the way, which is, you would have been charged with fraud even during apartheid. Now, contrast this to democratic South Africa, where in apartheid, if you unclassified yourself as Black to colored or whatever other race, you would be lauded as a hero, right? You would ride into the sunset as a South African struggle icon, and yet today you're called some pejorative, right? You're accused of I've even seen this myself, of being an operative of white monopoly capital, believe it or not. But that's when this issue was actually mooted in parliament. It's when Mr. Snyman was accused of fraud, and guess who rushed to his defense? The EFF. The EFF said it is absolutely not the government's position to dictate to this man which race he decides to group with. And they chastised and pointed out the history of race in South Africa, and that to continue to operate through the lens of the Population Registration Act is to continue to project the evil of those acts of parliament from the apartheid days. And when the then education MEC, who was a DA member, found out about Mr. Snyman facing fraud charges over this declassification, she was equally horrified. So too was Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, by the way, who was the Minister of Home Affairs at the time, when this issue was brought to him. And he said he moving forward, he will have Home Affairs use, instead of race, I think he said socioeconomic indicators or culture. It was definitely a move away from race as a way of categorizing people. under Home Affairs. But he said that it is actually Tula Singisi, who was at the time the Minister of Labor, Employment and Labor, right? And he's the one who insisted that race still has a place because obviously the Employment Equity Act and the Commission of Employment. But there's been some degree of agreement across the three biggest parties. And I'd even argue with the MK because they're this Africanist party. And I've heard at least one of their members say to be African is to identify as African, right? To include different people of all races. They've suggested that we can, to me, it suggests that we can jettison the idea of race altogether in favor of all being African. So yeah, I think you'll find that there's actually, for people who understand the history of South Africa, value that, you know, race shouldn't still have a role, as big a role as it does in society today, and that we should move on from race really just being one human race or just African.
Absolutely. And let me come in here because we're in the last 5 minutes of the show. And I want us to talk about, because there's a question here which speaks to this of, okay, fine. Let me actually read the question from Ubantu. Welcome, Bantu. Thank you for watching. However, are things supposed to be left as they are? Should there be no redress in South Africa? People do not just find themselves in the situationship, no, they're in that word, situationship. And let me have a first bite of this one. Bantu, the simple answer is no. No South African liberal, no South African classical liberal, and no one here at least, is going to argue that there aren't any ill effects and bad effects from the race classification of whether it was our colonial days, apartheid, or even today. The issue we have is, how do you end race classification as a means of picking winners and losers in society by simply replicating what was done in the past, but switching the deck chairs of who's a winner and who's a loser. And we're arguing that that is Nelly Saw. That is a terrible approach to doing that. What you actually really want is a government, for example, that says, if we're going to have an empowerment policy, I'm going to empower you. I'd love to have a politician stand on a podium one day and literally say, you know, I'm going to use the institutions of government progressively in a gradual way, in other words, gradually shifting away, sorry, I know there's a terrible grammar there, of saying, actually, it isn't government's role to necessarily empower people. However, insofar as the kind of South Africa that we have, there is a need to empower people. In that kind of a South Africa, we're not going to use race. I'm going to use your socioeconomic background effectively to empower you. In other words, I'm not going to use race. I'm going to use your poverty, your state of whether you have opportunity or not to empower you, so that you have a policy like BEE or employment equity being scrapped, and rather saying, if there's going to be any preferential access given to state business or state contracts, it's not because you're black, it's because you're poor. I will give you an opportunity because you're poor to get a leg up, and then after that, you're empowered. You're on your own. You have the ability at that stage to compete like anybody else. That would be the shift in thinking. That's true non-racialism in a sense, where the color of your skin is completely irrelevant insofar as picking a winner and a loser in society. But again, don't take it from me. We have a panel tonight who can maybe discuss this in greater detail. Martin, let's talk about that, and let's maybe aim and shape the conversation towards saying two things. One, opposition ministers in the GNU, what should they be doing in those institutions now, and also in cabinet, to start to persuade the overall sentiment to move in a non-racial way, number one, and what does non-racial policy look like in just, let's say, key areas, right? And I'll ask you the same question, Makone, but as we maybe taper off and complete our conversation, let's answer that question, Martin. What does a non-racial South Africa policy-wise look like?
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. So kind of how far the kind of non-racialist ministers in the GNU can push it, I'm quite cynical about that. I said since before the GNU that the opposition parties won't have the leverage, and it seems that's confirmed every day to kind of really push for this kind of change. So I don't think that they can change the sentiment. What I would rather have them do is engage in call it sabotage. They must conduct themselves in their portfolios in a way that progressively makes race in that portfolio irrelevant, and they must do whatever they can to sabotage the efforts of their colleagues in applying race. I'm using a very strong word, but just to communicate the point. Obviously, they'll be fired if they do anything kind of too on the nose, but they have to be doing kind of something that pushes things in that direction. And then I think the easiest place to start is in your own portfolio. So home affairs, I mean, that's an opposition. It's not an opposition controlled portfolio. I must stop using that word. It is controlled by a smaller party than the ANC. And that is historically during apartheid where racial classification existed. Home affairs, that's the portfolio. That's where people's identities for the government are stored. So that minister in that portfolio can potentially do quite a bit to de-racialize many aspects of how we as South Africans go about what we do. The other thing potentially that they can do is lay perhaps on the president when people have to be appointed to the Human Rights Commission. The current commissioner for human rights, Chepo Madlingozi, is a race baiter of note. So he's a very problematic character, and I'd say that in my own kind of personal capacity there as a legal scholar, I've come across his thesis and so on. He's no friend of non-racialism or of the Constitution. So kind of when it comes time to appoint these people, there must be an effort to actually get good non-racialists in there. That would be my second point. And then what does non-racial policy look like? Shikhle, you kind of touched on it. It's actually extremely simple. There is people enjoy the rhetoric of complexity, and they say that it's difficult. It's so difficult. There's no easy answer. There is an easy answer. The Constitution gave us the answer, and the answer that you gave is an easy answer. You remove any reference to race and you replace it by socioeconomic need. It's a purely formalistic kind of pen to paper change. It can happen overnight, and I think the results of the more fair system that is would also be evident overnight. It won't be something that takes time. But just I would go a step further, and I would say that a better non-racial policy is actually, you alluded to this, is to take government empowerment out of the occasion. And I'm happy to be the radical in the room on that. But I think that if you look at examples around the world where governments have pursued free market dispensations, where the government actually just said, listen, we are not competent to empower. We are a bunch of imbecilic politicians. We cannot do that. Let us go hands off. In that vacuum, call it a vacuum, fine. In that vacuum, ordinary people do the things that are necessary to empower themselves. People are not self-defeatist. They want to succeed. And if given the opportunity, they will do that. So get government out of the way. We are in this position because governments wanted to do too much in the economic affairs of the people within their jurisdictions. So remove the cancer, remove the government, and you will see the closest thing that humanity can see to magic. So just get government out of the way ultimately. Thanks, Ikwe.
Absolutely. And I want to quickly say something before I throw this to Makone, because I think Martin raises important points here. You know, we really should move away. Actually, I'm going to swing with a double-edged sword. I'm very mindful of the fact that there is a role and a function for the government at the moment, which goes beyond the functions that I ordinarily, as a classical liberal, wanted to operate in. Simply put, as a transitional period, I recognize the government is going to do things that I'm not comfortable for it to ordinarily do as its ordinary functions. And it's in that vein that I'm arguing that you're going to use the state, but shift how it does things for that transition period as you try and lift up as many people as possible in society to a point where they can compete and live and really self-own, do things for themselves. And really, we talk a lot as liberals about the individual and, you know, the self, but really we're a family society. And insofar as we talk about individuals, people mostly act on benefit for the benefit of their families. So I would say this. I want a situation where you have a government that focuses, and let me be specific, let me look into the camera and say this. I want the government of national unity to be two things. One, populated by more people who are liberty orientated, who are actually non-racial, and push out those individuals who are state-centric socialist or communist, and state-centric socialist and communist worse yet in a race through a racialized fashion. Those people you need to push out of government, generally speaking, as you gradually shrink the size of government and shrink its importance to ordinary people. And number two, as you're doing that, and I'm going to forget my second point. Yes. And number two, as you're doing that, the policy environment reflects a non-racial approach where you say, as I said earlier on, the state is not going to do everything for you, but for a transition period, recognizing the mistakes of the past, it's going to focus on what we call enabling opportunities in economics, education, healthcare, and safety and security as the means to genuinely empower people in that non-racial way, so that whether you're black, white, Indian, or colored, it's irrelevant. If you live in a safe environment, it is a massive, massive boon for your ability as an individual or family to pursue your self-interest because you're safe. Whether you are black, Indian, or white is relevant because the quality of education that's provided to you by the private sector, whether it's subsidized by the state via vouchers or whatever, is of a non-racial level where you don't worry about people who can afford a private school, high quality education. You worry about poor people who cannot. You give those individuals a voucher, not because they're black, but because they're poor. And again, this idea that we make black synonymous with poor is erroneous, but for the sake of this conversation, I'll do that. And I can go down the line on these other enabling opportunities, which I said is education, healthcare, safety, and security. As to whether the state should be picking who gets a contract or a tender based on race, that crap can end. We can scrap policies like BEE, we can scrap policies like employment equity in this country and still have a functioning, or let me rephrase, and actually then have a free, prosperous, non-racial, and property-owning South Africa. That's what we as classical liberals stand for. Now, I know, sorry, Makone, I really had to add a little bookmark just as my own parting shot here, but we'll give you the final word to these GNU ministers, to the GNU government, and really to South Africans. Why is non-racialism important, and what would that look like in a policy sense? Makone.
I wish to counter conspiracies by saying I think Martin will actually be surprised that the SAHRC person we will be meeting is actually Prof. Madlingozi himself.
Oh, yes!
So Martin wouldn't have known this as he was making his statement because he no longer works for the IRR. And you saw his natural reaction there as I name dropped. But we can come back on the show and discuss how that went. I'm actually quite optimistic, Martin, as somebody who also knows Prof. Madlingozi's position somewhat well. And then on the GNU ministers, I'm also not confident. Just going off of the statement of intent, you'll see the inherent contradictions there, where in one aspect they mention appointments based on merit, and in the other they contradictorily talk about equitable distribution of positions. And so I think that speaks to the clash in positions between the ANC and the DN and the rest of the GNU partners. But I will say first and foremost, you do need to make appointments based on merit. And if you do that, the state will function as it should, and then resources will naturally fall where they should, and it's disproportionately to the previously disadvantaged, who are no longer determined by race, right? They are determined by social and economic disadvantage, right? So let's use economics as a proxy for distribution of state resources rather than race. Yeah. And then secondly, apart from that, merit-based appointments, EED is a concept, the IRR, which is we could do a switcheroo from BE to ED, which is economic empowerment of the disadvantaged, similarly to what I just said. Basically, instead of using race as a determinant of disproportionate distribution of state resources, let's use somebody's economic background, because that actually targets the issue of poverty better than race. Race does not tell us that somebody's poor. Like you said, Sihle, we should not use black and poor as though they are alternates of one another. So definitely EED and those merit-based appointments would
Absolutely.
be the two things that I think GNU ministers can really make the target or the object of redressing the issue of racialization and racial classification.
Absolutely. And, Makone, even as you're saying that, I'm not blind to the fact that, because I know it's going to happen in the comment section, those who still believe in BE, those who still believe in a racialized way will say, oh, there goes Big Daddy Liberty, the Uncle Tom and the coon, the house Negro, yada, yada, blah, 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 fish paste. And I always say this, the individuals who defend race-based empowerment legislation the most in this country are the empowered and often politically connected Black individuals, often even at the expense of poor Black individuals. Who do you think are the greatest beneficiaries of legislation in this country which has a preferential basis based on race? It is those of that race who are most equipped to effectively access that preferential treatment, if you will. It isn't the poor Black individual. There isn't some poor Black guy from my home farm area of Mshane who's saying, yeah, I'm totally going to be a beneficiary of BEE. Oh, no. The beneficiaries of BEE primarily are those individuals who are either as Black individuals come from very privileged backgrounds already, or alternatively politically connected backgrounds. So that when you then look at the criticism of this, of why we, rather, if you then look at who is criticizing us, it's usually those individuals. Anyway, maybe with that being said, let me end the show there, guys. Thank you so much for having joined me. Of course, I have been in studio with Martin from Staden from the Free Market Foundation. Martin, as a final parting shot, as I always say, how do the folks find you on your social media if you want to be found?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to follow my work specifically, I have a website that's martinvanstaden.com. You'll find all of my articles. You'll find all of my socials. You can follow me on Twitter. That's at Martin_ASFL. Please follow me there if you want to stay up to date in real time. And then please also visit the Free Market Foundation's website. That's freemarketfoundation.com. We do a lot of pro-free enterprise work there with non-racialism kind of as a clear and an unequivocal undertone. And then finally, again, please do visit the Index of Race Law. That's racelaw.co.za, which I maintain for the Institute of Race Relations. And please, if you want to fact check me, please do so. I am very desperate for people to help out quantify this problem, and maybe if I've overstated the number of race laws, please do correct me. I have no interest in saying that there's a specific number. So please go there, do the research, look at the laws, and if I've overcounted, let me know. And if I've undercounted, please, of course, do let me know. Racelaw.co.za. Thanks, Ikle.
Makone, how do the folks find you on social media?
SARR on LinkedIn and on Twitter. A lot of my publications are channeled through the Institute of Race Relations.
Absolutely. And of course, you can find that and more on the Institute of Race Relations publication, The Daily Friend, at dailyfriend.co.za. Major thanks to the both of you as I let you go. And thank you, dear viewer, for watching tonight's broadcast. Let me know what you think about the show. Let me know what you think about this idea that we're pushing as the liberty-orientated individuals that South African government, as this government of national unity, South Africa as a society, must abandon, drop, kick to the curb the idea of using race and racist policies to pick winners and losers in society. I'm going to say this as I did on the other episodes of the What South Africa Can Be campaign, because what we're talking about here is exactly what we want South Africa to be, non-racial. Guys, I am listening to you. I'm listening to you as you're saying this. We've taken to the streets, we've talked to you, and I'm listening to you. And part of that argument is what we'll bring into government. Say, guys, this is what South Africans are really saying. This is what they want, and they want you to abandon race and treat South Africans really in an equal sense, in the true meaning of that word, in a non-racial sense, in the true meaning of that word. Guys, thank you very much for watching this broadcast. Apologies if I'm sounding nasal and for the occasional coughing. But with that being said, reminder, pardon me, to you to hit that like button if you love the content. Please do it as you exit tonight's show. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. With that being said, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on Thursday at 7:30 for another installment of the What South Africa Can Be campaign, where I bring you what folks in inner city Johannesburg said on what we can make South Africa to ideally be. That being said, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on Thursday.